She walked into his dojo in plain gray sweats, no belt, no rank, no reputation, and he laughed before she even crossed the mat. What Victor Hale didn't know, what nobody in that room knew, was that the quiet woman carrying a hospital badge in her jacket pocket had spent 6 years executing classified missions in places most soldiers never came back from. She had disarmed men twice his size in the dark. She had kept a wounded teammate alive for 11 hours in a hostile mountain range with nothing but field supplies and refusal to quit. She was a trauma nurse named Dara Wynn, and she was about to ruin his entire afternoon. If you're new here, welcome. Stay until the end of this story, because it only gets more intense from here. If it moves you, hit like, subscribe, and drop a comment with the city you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. The Kessler Martial Arts Center sat on the second floor of a converted warehouse on the industrial edge of Callaway City, and it smelled exactly like what it was. Old sweat, cheap rubber flooring, and the specific kind of ego that needed a room to expand into. The walls were papered with Victor Hale's tournament wins. Photographs, trophies behind glass, framed magazine profiles with headlines like "The Last Real Fighter" and Callaway's Iron Standard. A mirror ran the full length of one wall, floor to ceiling, angled so that every student could see themselves training, but mostly so Victor could watch himself while he taught. He was 41 years old and had built the dojo from a struggling strip mall operation into the most recognized martial arts school in the region. I had legitimate credentials: a 4th-degree black belt in Krav Maga, a Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu brown belt, national-level competition wins from his late 20s. He worked hard for those things. Nobody disputed that. What people disputed, quietly, carefully, so he wouldn't hear, was what he had become in the years since. Victor had a way of walking into a room that made everyone adjust. His students stood straighter when he entered. They answered faster. They apologized more than necessary. He called it standards. His longtime assistant instructor, a wiry 26-year-old named Theo Marsh, called it something else when Victor wasn't listening, but never loud enough to matter. On the 3rd Saturday of the month, Kessler held open demonstrations. Free entry, public welcome, designed to recruit new students and give current ones a chance to perform. It was good business. Victor ran the session himself, chose the format, chose who participated, and kept careful control over the room's energy. This particular Saturday had drawn maybe 60 people, some regulars, some curious walk-ins, a cluster of teenagers in the back who'd heard about it through social media. Theo was handling registration near the entrance when Dara Wynn came in. She signed the guest sheet with her left hand, which Theo noticed because almost nobody did that. She was mid-30s, medium build, brown hair pulled back in a functional ponytail that had nothing to do with style and everything to do with getting it out of her face. She wore gray sweatpants, a worn athletic shirt with a small bleach stain near the hem, and cross-training shoes that had logged serious mileage. No jewelry, no branding. She carried a small nylon bag over one shoulder. "First time?" Theo asked. "To this place, yeah," she said. That was the whole conversation. She found a spot along the wall and watched. Victor's demonstrations followed a pattern. He'd open with a lecture on philosophy, discipline, focus, the relationship between physical and mental control, and then move into technique showcases where his advanced students sparred and he narrated. It was polished, rehearsed, but effective. He had a presence on the mat that was genuinely worth watching, even if the performance around it had grown bloated with self-congratulation. Dara stood near the water station and watched without expression. She wasn't taking notes. She wasn't checking her phone. She was simply watching, with the particular quality of attention that belongs to people who have learned to absorb information quickly because lives depended on it. Victor noticed her in the way he noticed everyone, as a piece of the room, as an audience member to perform for. He clocked her as a civilian immediately. The clothes, the stillness, the fact that she wasn't reacting to anything with appropriate awe. It mildly annoyed him. During the open floor portion, when Victor usually invited guests to ask questions or volunteer for light demonstrations, he scanned the room with the comfortable authority of someone running his own kingdom, and his eyes landed on Dara. "You," he said, pointing, "gray. You look like you've been in a gym before. Come on out." It wasn't an invitation. His tone was the particular brand of command that was framed as casual, but left no real room to decline without looking afraid. Dara looked at him for a moment. Then she stepped forward. The crowd shifted. A few of his regular students exchanged glances. They knew this routine. Victor liked to bring in volunteers and use them to demonstrate control techniques. Painlessly, technically, but in a way that made the volunteer feel out of their depth and made Victor look effortlessly dominant. "What's your name?" Victor asked. "Dara." "You have any training, Dara?" "Some," she said. He smiled. It was the smile of a man who had already written the next 3 minutes in his head. "Okay, I'm going to show the group a basic wrist control technique. I'll move slow. Just want to demonstrate the mechanics. You good with that?" "Sure," Dara said. She stood with her arms at her sides. Victor reached out and took her right wrist in both hands, the standard grip for the entry he was demonstrating. Thumb pressure here, rotation there, control of the elbow to move the body. He'd done this 10,000 times. He started explaining the mechanics to the crowd as he began applying the technique. What happened next took less than 2 seconds. Dara's left hand came up, not fast and not slow, but with the particular economy of motion that belongs to people who've stopped thinking about movement and started just doing it. She redirected the pressure on her wrist, rotated her forearm, stepped into his space, not away from it, and Victor found himself facing the mat from below, his arm at a precise angle that made movement genuinely inadvisable. She hadn't rushed, she hadn't made a sound. She had simply interrupted his technique with a better one. The room was quiet for a beat. Victor's jaw tightened. He felt the correctness of her control. Not just strength, but mechanical precision, the kind that meant she understood exactly what she was doing and why. And something dark and defensive moved behind his eyes. "Okay," he said, getting up slowly. "Okay, where'd you learn that?" "Here and there," Dara said. Laughter moved through the crowd, but it was uneasy. A few of his students looked at each other. Theo had stopped straightening equipment near the edge of the mat and was just watching. "Right." Victor rolled his shoulders. His smile was back, but it was a different smile now. "Let's try something a little more involved. I want to see your footwork. Just light contact." Dara nodded. They reset. Victor moved with the controlled aggression of someone who had decided he needed to reestablish something. He feinted left, stepped, came in with a controlled grab at her collar. And Dara broke his grip, pivoted on her back foot, and used his forward momentum to put him off balance for the second time. She didn't take him to the ground. She just made it clear, with no urgency and no drama, that she could. Victor stepped back. His breathing had changed. The silence in the room felt different now. It had weight. "You're not here to take a class, are you?" he said. It wasn't quite a question. "I'm just watching," Dara said. "You invited me out." Something crossed his face, not quite anger yet, but its early architecture. He looked at his students, at the guests, at the mirror, and made a decision that the part of him built on 4 decades of ego was always going to make. "You know what I think?" Victor said, loud enough for the room. "I think someone taught you 1 or 2 cute tricks, and you walked in here hoping to find a moment. I see it all the time." He gestured around the space. "This is a controlled demonstration, not a street fight. You got lucky with positioning." Dara looked at him. "I didn't say anything about luck." "No, but you're standing there like you proved something." His voice had the kind of confidence that fills a room, not because it's earned in the moment, but because it's been practiced. You want to actually learn something, stay for the full class. Otherwise, thanks for the participation. He turned back to the room, already signaling the session back to his control. Dara picked up her bag. She didn't argue. She didn't say anything else. She walked toward the exit with the unhurried movement of someone who had made a decision miles before she arrived. Theo was near the door. He watched her go, and then watched Victor relaunch the demonstration with an extra layer of volume that was doing double duty as confidence it wasn't entirely feeling. The video went up that evening. One of the teenagers in the back had been recording on his phone. Not the whole session, just the 2 exchanges on the mat, because he'd had the instinct that something worth capturing was happening. He posted it to his account with a minimal caption and went to bed. By midnight, it had 4,000 views. By the following morning, it had 46,000. By Monday, it was sitting at 200,000 and climbing with the specific velocity that only happens when something catches people in a feeling they can't quite name but can't stop passing on. Victor's technique was clearly good. That was visible. But what captured people was Dara. The complete absence of performance in her movement. No aggression, no visible calculation, no reaction to being dismissed. Just clean, exact response. And then walking away. The comment sections were loud. Former martial arts practitioners weighing in on her technique. Military veterans commenting without details, but with a specific kind of recognition in their words. People who'd never thought about combat sports a day in their lives sharing it because the moment she redirected Victor's grip resonated with something beyond technique. Something about not needing to announce what you're capable of. Victor spent Sunday monitoring it. By Sunday night, he had posted his own response video, professionally lit, in full uniform, speaking directly to camera about the importance of controlled environments, proper instruction, and how a single demonstration moment taken out of context could be misread. It landed badly. The comments on his response were worse than the original. By Monday morning, 3 of his longtime students had sent him private messages expressing concern about the response video's tone. His phone had fielded 2 calls from a regional martial arts organization asking him to clarify statements he'd made in the clip about the visitors' training being clearly recreational. Theo, who had been with him for 4 years, sat in the dojo's small back office and said, with more care than the situation deserved, "Victor, the problem isn't the video. The problem is the video is accurate." "She got lucky twice," Victor said. Theo looked at the wall for a moment. "I was standing 6 feet away. It wasn't luck." Victor's eyes went flat. "Whose dojo is this?" Theo didn't answer that. He went back out to the floor and started setting up for the Monday class, and the conversation ended, but nothing about it was resolved. Dara worked a 12-hour shift at Callaway Regional Hospital on Sunday, 7 to 7 in the trauma unit, and didn't look at her phone until she was in the parking garage, keys in hand, at 7:14 in the evening. A coworker, a charge nurse named Rosa Fielding, had texted her 4 times. The last message read, "Dara, I am not joking. You need to look at this right now." She looked at it in the driver's seat of her 10-year-old truck with the overhead light on because the garage lighting was terrible. She watched the video twice. Her expression didn't change much. She set the phone face down on the passenger seat and drove home. Her apartment was a 3rd-floor unit in a building that had been a textile warehouse before the city rezoned the district. High ceilings, concrete floors she'd covered with 2 overlapping rugs, a kitchen she'd gotten functional but not comfortable, a shelf of medical references on one wall. On the opposite wall, mounted in a plain frame, a photograph of 8 people in a desert landscape that gave nothing away about where or when. She was 3rd from the left, younger, thinner in the face, squinting against the sun. She made food, rice, whatever vegetables were still usable, and ate at the counter and thought about the video with the clinical part of her brain that had been trained to assess situations without attaching to them. It was out. It would move the way things moved. There wasn't much to be done about it. What she didn't plan for was the message that came Tuesday morning. She was prepping a patient for post-op monitoring when Rosa flagged her for a call at the nurse's station. Not on her cell, on the unit line. "Says it's from a Major Harlan Voss," Rosa said, with the particular expression of someone trying not to ask questions and failing. "Department of Defense." Dara's hands didn't stop what they were doing. She finished securing the monitoring lead, told her patient she'd be back in 10 minutes, and went to the station. "This is Dara Wynn," she said. "Ms. Wynn." The voice was measured, institutional, dry as briefing paper. "This is Major Harlan Voss, Army Recruiting and Retention Joint Coordination Office out of Fort Aldous. I'll be brief. A piece of video came across our internal communications channel yesterday. The one from the Kessler facility in Callaway City." "I've seen it," Dara said. "I assumed. 2 of our personnel with Tier 1 backgrounds reviewed it independently and flagged it up the chain. They weren't interested in the dojo owner." A pause. "We're interested in you." Dara leaned one shoulder against the wall and watched a medication cart roll past the end of the hallway. "I'm a civilian nurse, Major Voss." "Yes. I have your discharge paperwork, your transition records, your current employer. I'm aware of what you are now." Another pause, with more weight in it. "I'm also aware of what you were, and so are 2 people who watched that video and recognized a VBSS qualification drill executed at what one of them described as textbook plus." Those are his words. She said nothing. "We're not calling about recruitment," Voss said. "There's a situation developing that involves individuals and a training program connected to your previous unit's operational area. I can't be more specific on an unsecured line, I'm asking if you're willing to have a conversation. The PA system above her head chimed and announced a code response 3 floors down. She watched 2 nurses break into a run at the far end of the corridor. When? She said. Thursday. Wherever you're comfortable. She thought for 2 seconds. There's a coffee place on Meridian and 6th, grounds and cones, 8 in the morning. We'll be there, Voss said. Thank you, Ms. Wynn. The line went clear. Rosa was pretending to check inventory on a cart 4 feet away. Dara walked back to her patient's room and did not explain the call. Victor Hale announced the rematch on Tuesday afternoon. He posted it across every platform simultaneously. A structured, professionally edited challenge video, clearly made with help, in which he addressed the video circulating from Saturday's demonstration and invited the unnamed visitor to return for a formal, witnessed, structured sparring session open to the public. He was careful with his wording. He didn't say she'd cheated. He said he wanted to give her a proper platform. He said he believed in transparency and accountability in martial arts. The framing was calculated. He was trying to reclaim the narrative by positioning himself as magnanimous, the established professional offering a fair stage to someone who'd gotten lucky in an informal setting. His core audience responded positively. His comment sections filled with people tagging others, building anticipation. What Victor hadn't accounted for was that people who had already decided what they'd seen in the original video weren't going to be moved by reframing. And the people who'd never heard of Victor Hale until 2 days ago weren't starting from his version of the story. Within 3 hours, someone tracked down Dara's name from the sign-in sheet at Kessler. Theo confirmed later he didn't know how. And by Tuesday evening, Dara Wynn trauma nurse Calloway was a live search thread. What people found was a work history, a nursing license, 7 years at Calloway Regional, committee memberships, a CPR certification instructor role for 3 seasons. What they didn't find, because there wasn't anything to find, was any martial arts competition record, any listed training affiliation, any background that explained what they'd watched. That absence became its own story. The speculation that followed ranged from probably just trained with someone good to fragments of posts from accounts with military backgrounds who didn't identify themselves but wrote things like, I've seen that entry sequence in exactly one training program, and it isn't civilian, and the way she moved off the center line on the second exchange is not something you learn at a dojo. These posts were screenshot and reshared across platforms with the momentum of something people had decided was true before they could explain why. Victor read all of it. He did not sleep well Tuesday night. Dara arrived at Grounds & Co. on Thursday at 7:52, found a corner table with clear sightlines to both the entrance and the counter, and ordered black coffee. She was on the second cup when 3 men came through the door at 8:04. 2 were in civilian clothes, slacks, plain jackets, the particular brand of unremarkable that was its own kind of uniform. The third wore Army service uniform, silver oak leaf on his collar. Major Voss was 50-something, square-built, with close-cropped gray hair, and the face of someone who had given the same briefing in many different rooms and adjusted his delivery each time. They settled across from her without the formality of a proper introduction, because everyone in the exchange already understood that wasn't the point. We'll keep this informal, Voss said. I assumed, Dara said. One of the plainclothes men opened a slim folder and didn't slide it across the table, just angled it so she could see. It held 3 photographs, surveillance quality, outdoor settings, faces partially obscured. She recognized 2 of the locations from geographical context. Her expression didn't move. You recognize any of these individuals? Voss asked. I don't know if I should answer that without knowing what this is, she said. Voss nodded, like that was the right response. Fair. There's a private military training program operating under a defense contractor designation that has some irregularities. The contract is connected to infrastructure in a region your unit operated in during your last 2 deployments. We have a source who made contact about 6 weeks ago, provided a partial organizational chart, and then went dark. Went dark how? Dara asked. Voss looked at her for a moment. In the permanent sense, she set her coffee down. And you're bringing this to me because you have specific knowledge of the operational environment, specific skill qualifications that are relevant. And as of 72 hours ago, you are actively in the public eye in a way that could either be a problem or an advantage, depending on how we approach the next 30 days. She looked at the photographs again without touching them. You're not asking me to come back in. No, you're a civilian nurse and you have every right to stay one. Voss folded his hands on the table. But the individual who's been identified as the operational lead on this program, he has a name that's going to become familiar to you very soon through a completely separate channel. And when it does, I wanted you to have context before it did. What name? Dara said. The second plainclothes man spoke for the first time. His voice was quieter. Garrison Mack. The sound of the cafe continued around them. The milk steamer, the door opening and closing, someone laughing at the counter. Dara's expression stayed level. But something in the set of her jaw changed infinitesimally, and Voss caught it. You know him, Voss said. I knew of him, Dara said carefully. He wasn't in my unit. He was adjacent to a situation during my second deployment. I never interacted with him directly. She paused. He was a contract trainer, private. Still is, the quiet man said. Much larger operation now. Dara sat back in her chair and looked at the wall for a moment. The photograph of 8 people in the desert frame in her apartment came up in her mind without invitation. The people in it, what some of them had come back from, what some of them hadn't come back from at all. The video that went around this week, she said. Does it create a problem for this? It creates visibility, Voss said. Whether that's a problem depends on choices made in the next several days. He picked up his coffee finally. I'm not here to pressure you into anything, Ms. Wynn. I'm here because the information we've developed suggests a timeline that may overlap with some personal decisions you're about to be asked to make. Victor Hale's challenge, she said flatly. He's not connected to any of this, Voss said. He's just noise, but the way you respond to that noise could matter. A pause. Or you could decline and go back to your unit, and none of this touches you. She looked at the photographs one more time. Something in her face settled. Not hardness, but the particular kind of resolution that doesn't require an audience to be real. I'll think about it, she said. Voss nodded. He didn't push. He closed the folder, pushed back his chair, and left her with a plain card that had a number on it and nothing else. She worked her shift Thursday evening, 4 p.m. to close, a rough one, a car accident rollover that came in hard and took everything the trauma team had for 2 hours straight. She got home at midnight with dried antiseptic on her forearms and enough exhaustion to sleep without thinking. But she didn't sleep. She sat on the edge of her bed and looked at the photograph on the wall across the room. Third from the left. Younger. Squinting against the sun. One of the people in that photograph, a woman named Petra, who'd been her closest operational partner during the second deployment, had died 14 months ago. Not in the field. At home, in a city that was supposed to be safe, under circumstances that her family was still waiting for answers about. The case was officially unresolved. The name Garrison Mack lived in a specific drawer in Dara's memory, the one she kept closed because opening it took something from her that she'd worked 4 years to rebuild. She looked at the plain card on her nightstand. She thought about Victor Hale's challenge video, sitting in her watch history. The performance of it. The way he'd tried to turn what happened into something he could manage. She thought about Petra. She picked up her phone, not the card, and typed a response to Victor Hale's public challenge through a clean account that had no connection to her name. Short, direct. A time. A date. A willingness. And then she set the phone down and thought about what she might actually be walking into. Not the dojo, not the rematch, not the crowd that was going to gather. Something much larger had already been set in motion, and the man at the center of it didn't know her name yet, but he was about to learn it. The response posted at 12:47 in the morning, and by the time Dara's alarm went off at 6, it had already been found. Someone in the comment thread of Victor's challenge video had spotted the reply from the anonymous account. No profile photo, no history, just a handle and 8 words. Saturday, 10 a.m. Your floor. I'll be there. The timestamp, the phrasing, the absence of any further engagement had the comment section spinning within the hour. Screenshots moved across platforms before sunrise. By the time Dara was parking at Callaway Regional for her Friday morning shift, the speculation had taken on the particular momentum of a crowd that had already decided what it wanted to happen and was now simply waiting for the world to catch up. Victor saw it at 5:58 a.m., still in bed, phone in hand, the blue light of it making his face look worse than it was. He read the reply 3 times. Then he texted Theo. She accepted. Theo's response came back fast because Theo was apparently already awake. I know. What do you want to do? Victor put the phone face down and stared at the ceiling for a while. He had spent the better part of 3 days telling himself, in various configurations, that what happened Saturday was a controlled setting, an uncontrolled variable, bad positioning on his part, and nothing more. He had said versions of this to his mirror, to his reflection in the dojo windows, to Theo in the back office. He had not quite said it convincingly to anyone. The honest part of him, the part that existed before the trophies and the magazine profiles and the institutional confidence he'd built like a wall around his actual self, knew what he'd felt when her hand came up on his wrist. He'd felt the gap. The distance between competent and exceptional was a physical sensation when you were on the wrong side of it, and Victor was good enough at what he did to know the difference. He picked his phone back up, confirmed the time, get the room set up properly, invite the organization rep, Saunders, not Lyle. He thought for a moment, then added, and get some mats down that aren't slippery on the west side. He was going to be ready. He was going to be better. He was absolutely 100% not going to think about the way she'd stepped into his space instead of away from it. Dara's Friday shift was a 10-hour stretch that left no room for thinking about anything except the work in front of her, which was exactly what she needed. The trauma unit at Callaway Regional ran at the kind of sustained pace that ate through personal preoccupation efficiently. There was always a chart, a family in the waiting room, a physician who needed information she had, a patient coming back from a procedure who needed someone present and focused. She was good at this. Not in the way people called nurses good when they meant kind and patient, though she was both of those things when it mattered. She was good in the operational sense. She read a room, she triaged information, she made fast calls in low-information environments, and was right more often than the odds suggested she should be. Rosa Fielding caught her at the supply station around 2 in the afternoon. Rosa was 10 years older, broad-shouldered, kept her reading glasses on a beaded chain, and had been at Callaway Regional long enough to have an institutional memory that the hospital administrator respected and occasionally feared. "You gonna do it?" Rosa asked, not pretending the question was about anything other than what it was about. "Do what?" Dara said. Rosa gave her the look. "The whole hospital knows about the video. Marguerite and Billing sent me a link. Billing, Dara." Dara closed the supply cabinet. "I already responded." Rosa stared at her. "When?" "Last night." "You—" Rosa lowered her voice, though no one was near them. "You actually said yes to the rematch? To that man's challenge video?" "He made it a public event," Dara said. "He framed it as transparency. Declining would have been its own statement." Rosa looked at her for a long moment. "Or you could just be done with it." "I could," Dara agreed and moved back toward her patient rooms. And Rosa stood at the supply station with her reading glasses on the chain and the specific expression of someone watching a person they care about do something they're not going to talk anyone out of. The call from the regional martial arts organization came Friday evening to the dojo's main line, and Theo answered it because Victor was on the floor running a private session and had asked not to be disturbed. The caller identified herself as Renata Saunders, Director of Standards and Conduct for the Tri-State Martial Arts Oversight Board. Theo knew the name. She reviewed competition ethics, arbitrated disputes, and had suspended 3 different school owners in the past 4 years for conduct violations that ranged from misrepresented credentials to documented bullying of junior students. She was not calling to offer support. "We've had 18 separate complaints in the past 72 hours, Saunders said. Her voice was the administrative kind, not cold but precise. From former students, 3 current students, and 2 instructors from affiliated schools. The content of the complaints predates this week's video, but the video appears to have prompted people to come forward about a broader pattern." Theo wrote this down with the mechanical instinct of someone who had learned to document everything. What kind of pattern? Systematic humiliation of students as a pedagogical method. Specific incidents of a guest being mocked in a public setting, which we now have video evidence of. And a response video that board members have described as dismissive and characterizing the guest's demonstrated skill as fraudulent. A pause. "We'll need to schedule a formal review." "When?" Theo asked. "We'd like to speak with Mr. Hale next week, Tuesday or Wednesday. I'll send a written notice to the registered address." Theo set down the pen. "I'll make sure he gets it." After the call ended, he sat in the back office for a while without moving. The sound of the session on the floor came through the wall. Victor's voice, carrying the easy authority that filled rooms, that made students feel both elevated and slightly diminished at the same time. Theo had been listening to that voice for 4 years. He had learned a great deal from Victor, genuinely. He had also watched that same voice turn on students who showed weakness, turn on the woman on Saturday for the crime of being unpredictable, turn on the video response into something that made the original moment worse. He picked up his phone and texted the notice information to Victor's number. Then he went back out to the floor because he still had a job and because problems didn't stop existing when you stopped looking at them. What? Dara spent Friday night doing something she hadn't done in over 2 years. She pulled the green canvas duffel from the top shelf of her bedroom closet and set it on the kitchen counter and opened it. The contents were organized by old habit. Nothing in it was current issue anything, just personal equipment she'd carried through 2 deployments and kept, because getting rid of it had never felt right and she hadn't needed to confront why. She wasn't there for the equipment. There was a folded piece of paper near the bottom, behind an elastic loop. She'd put it there a long time ago and kept moving the duffel around without opening it. She took the paper out and unfolded it on the counter. It was a handwritten list, operational handwriting, abbreviated, line items with dates and coordinates reduced to initials. A record she'd made for herself during her second deployment, the one she'd never formally submitted anywhere. Events that happened in a specific sequence. A contractor who'd been on site for a training evaluation who'd left before the outcome of that evaluation became known. A supply irregularity that got filed and then buried. A report she'd written that was downgraded from formal to informal before anyone with rank saw it. Garrison Mack's name wasn't on the list, but the position he'd occupied was. And the sequence of events that led from that position to the outcome she'd spent 4 years trying to stop thinking about was right there in her own shorthand, legible as a wound. She folded the paper, put it in the back pocket of her jeans, and left the duffel open on the counter. She picked up the plain card with the number on it. She didn't call. Not yet. She took a photograph of the list with her phone, saved it to a folder she encrypted, and then sat at her kitchen counter for a long time drinking water and thinking about the difference between walking away and choosing not to walk. There was a difference. She'd always believed that. Walking away was passive. Choosing not to walk was a decision made with full information, and the full information she had now was that someone she'd known, someone who'd been present in the same operational environment, had ended up dead under circumstances that hadn't been resolved. And a man whose presence connected to that operational environment was now running something larger under a legitimate contract designation. She wasn't law enforcement. She wasn't active military. She was a nurse with a security clearance she no longer used and a skill set she'd spent 4 years trying to keep at a distance. But she had the list. And she had the meeting with Voss on the record, which meant someone in an official capacity had already decided this was worth pursuing. She went to bed at 11:30. She set her alarm for 6. Saturday was 12 hours away. The crowd that showed up at Kessler on Saturday morning was not what Victor had planned for and not what Theo had anticipated when he'd set up the room at 7 a.m. They'd expected maybe 80, possibly 100. The core audience from the first event, some additional interest from the video. What arrived was closer to 250 people, filling the floor space, lined up along the walls, spilling into the small viewing area at the back that was normally used for parent observation during kids' classes. Victor had to turn the front door one in, one out by 9:45. Cameras were everywhere, not just phones. 2 people had brought proper video equipment, shoulder-mounted, with the practice setup of people who did this regularly. A woman near the equipment station had a press credential on a lanyard, local media or something adjacent. Victor noticed all of it and adjusted his posture accordingly, the way he'd learned to do years ago in competitions when he understood that being watched changed what you had to be. Theo stood near the door and counted bodies and felt the low-grade anxiety of someone who had organized enough events to know when a situation had exceeded its container. Dara arrived at 9:53. She came through the front with 2 other people, not dramatically, not with any kind of entrance. She was dressed the same way she'd been dressed the first time, functional athletic clothes, the worn cross trainers, hair back. The 2 people with her were a man and a woman who didn't introduce themselves to anyone and positioned themselves near the far wall with the specific economy of people who were there to observe and not participate. Nobody paid them much attention because Dara was the person the room had assembled to watch. Victor saw her come in. He straightened slightly. He had warmed up for 90 minutes that morning, longer than he'd prepared for a local event in 3 years. His knee was bothering him, had been since Wednesday, the old injury from a competition in his early 30s that never fully resolved, and he'd taped it and told himself it wasn't a factor. "Ms. Wynn," he said, crossing the mat toward her. He had decided in the planning conversations with himself over the past 48 hours that he was going to be controlled and professional. The video had gone wrong because he'd been defensive. Today, he was going to be measured. "I appreciate you coming." "You made it a public invitation," Dara said, same as she'd said about the original event. "Just stating a fact." Victor absorbed that. "How do you want to structure this?" She looked at the mat. "Same as before. Controlled demonstration. You explain the technique to the room, we work through it," she paused. "Or whatever you think is fair." Something in his chest settled slightly at fair. He hadn't expected that word. "We'll do 3 exchanges. I'll narrate for the room. Protective contact only." "That works," she said. They separated to opposite sides of the mat. The room's noise level dropped as the space between them widened. Theo moved to the side wall where he could see both of them without being in anyone's way. Victor addressed the room first, clean, professional, controlled, explaining the format, the objective, the context. He sounded good. He was good at that part. He watched the room respond to his voice and felt the familiar steadiness of standing in his own space on his own terms, and for a moment he thought maybe this was going to go fine. Then he turned back to the mat and looked at Dara, standing still in the center of it, and the steadiness wobbled slightly because she was watching him with no expression whatsoever, and it was the most unsettling thing in the room. The first exchange lasted 18 seconds. Victor opened with a controlled shoulder grab, the same technique he'd started with the previous Saturday, and this time he'd modified his grip and his stance to account for the redirect she'd used. He had spent time this week drilling the counter, asking one of his senior students to run it with him repeatedly until it felt automatic. She didn't use the same redirect. She stepped offline at an angle he hadn't trained for, applied pressure at his elbow rather than his wrist, and moved him in a circle that ended with him needing to step out or fall. He stepped out. The room exhaled collectively. Victor reset. His knee protested when he planted his right foot, and he adjusted his weight distribution without showing it. "Second exchange," he said to the room. "This time I'm going to demonstrate a different entry." The second exchange lasted 11 seconds. He changed his approach, went lower, targeting her center of mass rather than her arms, the kind of tackle entry that worked on opponents who were technique-reliant and unprepared for force over finesse. She sidestepped at the last possible moment, genuinely the last moment, no earlier, no dramatic anticipation, and used his own downward momentum to guide him toward the mat. She controlled the landing. He didn't hit it hard, but he hit it. He got up slowly. His knee was sending specific complaints he was filing away to deal with later. The room was not silent this time, not loud, but the specific low-current murmur of people recalibrating something they thought they understood. Victor stood on the mat and breathed for a moment. He had 2 options. He could construct the third exchange as something he could clearly demonstrate his expertise in, a weapon disarm, a ground technique from mount position, something from his area of deepest training where the gap would close. He could frame it that way, explain it that way, and the room would follow his framing because rooms followed competent framing. Or he could do the honest thing. He looked at Dara. She was watching him with that same stillness, and what he saw in it now that his ego had taken enough structural damage to let information through, wasn't condescension. It was patience. She was waiting for him to decide what kind of person he was going to be. "Third exchange," Victor said to the room. "I'm going to ask Ms. Wynn to lead." He paused. "I want to show the room what technique looks like from someone trained at a level I haven't seen close up in a long time." The murmur changed register. Dara blinked. It was the first involuntary thing he'd seen her do. She moved to the center of the mat and addressed the room herself, briefly, plainly, without performance. She explained a joint entry sequence, walked through the mechanics, and then demonstrated it on Victor, who went through it without resistance, feeling the architecture of it as it happened. The precision was extraordinary. She wasn't using strength. She was using geometry and timing, and the gap between what that required and what most people spent their training developing was visible in real time. When she finished, she stepped back. The room was quiet in a different way than before. Victor turned to face the audience. His knee was throbbing, and his pride was somewhere in the corner, collecting itself. But he said, and he meant it, which surprised him more than anything else in the past week. That's what genuine training looks like, not what I assumed it looked like, what it actually is. The applause that followed was not the performance applause his demonstrations usually got. It was slower, more considered, the kind that happens when people witness something they weren't expecting to witness. The two people who'd come in with Dara had not moved from the far wall. The man, mid-40s, large-framed, brown jacket, had been watching the exchanges with the concentrated attention of someone looking for something specific. The woman beside him was taking notes on a small pad, writing quickly without looking at her hand. When Dara stepped off the mat, the woman intercepted her. Not dramatically, she simply moved to where Dara was heading and spoke in a low voice. "We need 10 minutes. There's a development." Dara looked at her. "Mac?" "Related," the woman said. "Outside." They went through the side exit into the narrow maintenance corridor that ran behind the dojo's secondary storage room. The fluorescent light in the corridor was one of the buzzing kind that was either dying or broken enough to make everyone under it look slightly wrong. The man in the brown jacket was already there. "Sayers," the man said, not introducing himself, using it as an address to the woman. She nodded. He looked at Dara. There was a breach attempt on the contractor database at Fort Aldous Tuesday night. Military cyber flagged it. The access point that was targeted was the same record system where your discharge documentation and your service history are stored. Dara was still. "Whoever attempted it didn't get through," he continued, "but the attempt itself sent a signal that someone is trying to locate former personnel connected to a specific operational period." His voice was level, factual, carrying the information without editorializing. "Voss wanted you aware before any further public activity." "He thinks the video made me visible to the wrong people," Dara said. "He thinks it's possible." She looked at the buzzing light for a moment. The sound of the crowd on the other side of the wall was muffled but present. 250 people who had come to watch a martial arts rematch and had watched something else instead. "The breach attempt," she said. "Was there any connection established between that attempt and the MAC operation?" "Not confirmed," the woman said. "Not ruled out." Dara thought for exactly long enough. "Tell Voss I want to sit down, not a coffee shop, somewhere secure." She paused. "And tell him the list for my second deployment. I have it, hard copy and photographed." Something changed in both their postures. The man in the brown jacket glanced at the woman. "That changes what he needs to know," the man said. "I know," Dara said. "Tell him." She went back through the side door into the dojo. The crowd was beginning to filter toward the exit, the energy of the room winding down in the satisfied way that happens when something people came to see delivered more than they expected. Victor was near the entrance, talking with Renata Saunders, the oversight board director who had apparently shown up in person. Theo was standing slightly apart, watching the conversation with the careful expression of someone monitoring a weather system. Saunders was calm and professional. Victor was holding his ground but had lost the specific quality of volume he normally operated at. Dara was 3 steps toward the exit when Victor saw her and called her name. She stopped. He came across the room, not quickly, with the gait of a man favoring his right knee more than he'd want to admit. He stopped a few feet from her. The crowd noise had dropped off enough that the people near them could hear. "I owe you a real apology," he said. "Not a public one for optics, an actual one." He looked like it cost him something, which meant it was real. "Last Saturday I was dismissive and deliberately condescending, and I used the public setting to try to make you feel small. That wasn't about martial arts. That was about ego, and I'm not going to dress it up." Dara looked at him for a moment. "Okay," she said. "Okay." He hadn't expected that, apparently. "I'm not interested in performing forgiveness for the room," she said, not unkindly. "You said what needed saying. What you do with it going forward is your business." She nodded once and continued to the exit. Behind her, she heard Saunders resume her conversation with Victor in the tone of someone who had more to discuss and was not in a hurry. Outside, the late morning air was cool and smelled like car exhaust and concrete, and Dara stood on the sidewalk for a moment and let the week settle around her. The two people from the corridor had already gone. The sidewalk was full of people from the dojo filing out, a few of them looking at her, most of them too absorbed in their own conversations to pay attention. Her phone buzzed. A text from a number she didn't have saved. Tuesday. Secure facility. I'll arrange transport. V. She put the phone in her pocket. She was halfway to her truck when a second message came through. Same number. 2 words. He knows. She stopped walking. The crowd moved around her on the sidewalk, fluid and oblivious, and Dara stood in the middle of it with the specific stillness that had nothing to do with calm and everything to do with a person who has just been handed information that reorganizes everything they thought they understood about a situation. Garrison Mack knew she existed, and the breach attempt on her service records meant he'd been looking for exactly what he'd found. She made it to her truck. She locked the door, started the engine, and sat in the parking structure with her hands on the wheel and the engine idling, running through implications with the systematic speed of someone trained to think under pressure. The rematch was done. The video would circulate. Victor Hale would deal with whatever the oversight board handed him, and Theo would help him or wouldn't, and the dojo would either reckon with what it had become or wouldn't. None of that was the point anymore. What the point was a man she'd never met face-to-face who had just signaled, through a database breach that left a fingerprint, deliberately or not, that he understood she was a variable, and the only reason she was a variable was if he had something to protect that her existence threatened. 4 years. She'd spent 4 years not looking at that list, not calling anyone, not opening the drawer with his name adjacent to it. He had apparently not extended her the same courtesy. She put the truck in reverse and pulled out of the structure and drove toward her apartment with the steady, careful attention of someone who was now operating in a different kind of environment than they had been 12 hours ago, and was not, despite everything, afraid. She was something more focused than afraid. She was paying attention. And somewhere across the city, in a facility she didn't have the address for yet, the man whose operational history was written in the margins of the worst thing she'd ever been present for was also paying attention. The question was who would move first. The drive home took 14 minutes, and she spent all of it thinking about sequence, not emotion, not the specific cold that had moved through her chest when she read those 2 words in the parking structure. Sequence. What had happened, in what order, and what each step implied about what came next. It was how she'd been trained to process high-pressure information, and 4 years of civilian life had softened a lot of things about her, but not that. The breach attempt happened Tuesday night. Voss's people flagged it Wednesday. They sat on the information until Saturday, until after the rematch, which meant either they hadn't wanted to spook her before she made the public appearance, or they'd needed time to assess whether the breach and the Mac operation were definitively linked. Or both. Probably both. The second message, he knows, was more troubling than the breach itself, because it implied confirmation. Not he may know. Not we think he knows. He knows. That was Voss communicating something specific, that whoever had attempted the records breach had either succeeded on a second attempt or had found the information through another channel entirely. She got home. She locked her apartment door, put the chain on, she hadn't used the chain in 2 years, and sat at her kitchen counter with the duffel still open where she'd left it and the list still in her back pocket. She took out the list and read it again, not because she'd forgotten what was on it, because she needed to look at it with current information in mind and see if anything read differently now. It did. The supply irregularity she'd noted, the one that got downgraded from formal to informal before it reached anyone with rank, had a date on it, written in her shorthand. If she put that date against what Voss's people had told her about the contractor designation Mac was operating under now, the timeline wasn't coincidental. The irregularity preceded the contract award by roughly 8 months, which meant someone had moved resources before the contract existed officially, using a structure that wouldn't be visible until after the contract formalized it. It was the kind of thing that required either extreme carelessness or extreme confidence in your own invisibility. She thought about Petra. She thought about the way Petra's family had described her last weeks. Distracted, careful about what she said on the phone, asking questions about records storage and chain of custody procedures in the particular oblique way of someone who doesn't want to state directly what they're looking for. Petra had been a better analyst than Dara. She'd been better at the documentation side, the evidentiary side, finding the through line in a sequence of paperwork that looked unrelated until it didn't. If she'd been looking at the same period Dara was looking at and had gotten further along that thread, Dara stopped that line of thinking before it arrived somewhere she couldn't come back from quickly. She needed to be functional on Tuesday. She needed to be clear. She photographed the list again at higher resolution and emailed it to an address she'd maintained for 4 years without using, a dead drop, essentially, held by a lawyer in another state under a client confidentiality structure that had cost her $800 to establish and that she'd hoped she'd never need. Then she called Rosa. Rosa picked up on the second ring, which meant she'd been expecting the call. "You okay?" "Yes," Dara said. "I need to ask you something work-related. At noon on a Saturday. Can you cover my Tuesday shift? I'll cover 2 of yours. Your choice of dates." A pause. Rosa had covered for her before, twice, without asking for explanations. She was quiet long enough that Dara could hear a TV in the background, something that sounded like a cooking competition. "This connected to the coffee meeting you came back from looking like you'd swallowed a stone?" "Somewhat." "Fine," Rosa said, "but you're taking my December 23rd. Done. And you call me when you're—" Rosa stopped. "Just call me." "I will," Dara said, and meant it. Monday arrived the way Mondays did in the trauma unit, without preamble or mercy. A construction came in at 7:20 a.m., 2 patients with crush injuries and a third with a head laceration that looked worse than it was, and a blood pressure that said otherwise. Dara worked through it with the team, Dr. Fenwick on lead, 2 residents doing what residents did under pressure, which was follow instructions and try not to telegraph how much they weren't sure of, a surgical consult who arrived 22 minutes in and took over the most critical case with the particular abruptness of a surgeon who'd already decided what needed to happen before they'd finished reading the chart. She was good at the trauma floor in the way that people are good at things they've done long enough to stop thinking about the mechanics. The clinical part of her ran on its own track. The rest of her was running calculations. By 2 in the afternoon, the morning's cases had resolved into recovery and monitoring, and the unit had settled into its standard mid-afternoon rhythm. She documented, checked on patients, had a conversation with a family in the waiting area about what post-operative monitoring looked like for a crush injury and what they should watch for at home after discharge, answered their questions with the particular patience she reserved for people in waiting rooms, because waiting rooms were their own kind of trauma. Dr. Fenwick found her at the documentation station at 2:45. He was in his mid-50s, gray at the temples, had been at Callaway Regional longer than anyone except Rosa and the woman in medical records who was allegedly approaching her 40th year and planning nothing resembling retirement. He set a coffee on the counter beside her. She hadn't asked for one, and leaned against the station. "You were on that video," he said. He kept his voice down, not because anyone nearby would have cared, but because he was that kind of person. "Yes," she said. "I won't pretend I didn't watch it." He paused. "I won't pretend I was surprised either. I've worked with you for 4 years. Some of the calls you make in trauma situations, the speed of them, the sequencing, they don't come from nursing school." She looked at him. "I'm not asking questions," Fenwick said. "I just want to say, the floor is better for having you on it. Whatever you were before this, whatever you are now the patients in this unit have benefited from it in ways that'll never show up in any review." He picked up his coffee. "That's all." He walked away before she could respond, which she suspected was intentional. She sat with that for a moment. Then she went back to her documentation because the work was still there, and the cases didn't pause for anything. So, the transport Voss had arranged was a white panel van, unmarked, civilian plates, which arrived outside her building at 7:15 Tuesday morning, and which she almost didn't get into before she confirmed the driver via a protocol Voss had texted her Sunday night. A sequence of 3 questions with specific answers that would have been unknown to anyone who hadn't been briefed. The driver knew all 3. She got in. The facility was 40 minutes outside Callaway City, in an unremarkable industrial area that had the particular quality of places designed to look like nothing in particular. The building itself was a low concrete structure attached to what appeared to be a logistics company, with a parking area in the back that you couldn't see from the road. Inside, past a security desk that processed her ID without comment, she was walked through 2 corridors to a conference room that had no windows and very good lighting and a table with 6 chairs, 4 of which were occupied. Voss was there. The woman from the dojo, Sayers, was there. A man she didn't recognize with the bearing of someone who had been still for a very long time and was accustomed to it. And at the far end of the table, in civilian clothes, a woman in her early 60s with close-cropped white hair and reading glasses on a chain who introduced herself as Deputy Director Harwell from the Defense Investigative Services Division, and whose presence in the room elevated what Dara had expected this meeting to be into something considerably larger. "Sit down, Ms. Wynn," Harwell said. Not unkindly, just efficiently. Dara sat. "You sent us the list," Harwell said. "We've had 24 hours with it. I'm going to be direct with you about what it changes, and then I'm going to ask you some questions." "Go ahead," Dara said. Harwell opened a folder. "What you documented in that deployment record represents the earliest physical evidence we have of procurement manipulation in a contract chain that has since grown into a $26 million operation with documented ties to at least 3 current federal contracts." She said it plainly, like reading a weather report. "The individual you identified by position, who we can now confirm is Garrison Mack, has spent the past 4 years building a private training and logistics operation under a legitimate contractor shell that has significant military and federal law enforcement clients." "The irregularity I flagged," Dara said. "It was downgraded." "We know who downgraded it," Sayers said from her side of the table. "That individual is no longer in their position. The process of understanding how it was downgraded took us longer than it should have." "Petra Vance," Dara said. Not a question. The room was quiet for a moment. "Petra Vance made contact with a field agent from our division 14 months ago," Harwell said. "She provided partial documentation of the contract chain. 2 weeks after that contact, she died." "The official cause was ruled accidental," Dara said. "It was ruled accidental," Harwell said carefully, "because the physical evidence at the time did not definitively contradict that ruling. We have since developed information that suggests the circumstances were more deliberate than the initial investigation concluded." She paused. "I want to be honest with you about why you're in this room. It is partly because of the deployment record you preserved, which fills a 4-year gap in our documentation. It is partly because Garrison Mack's attempt to access your service records tells us he considers you a threat. And it is partly because what Petra Vance was building, the evidentiary chain she was assembling, was not complete when she died. She left people who were positioned to know things she knew. You are one of them." Dara kept her hands flat on the table. The urge to move them was real, and she suppressed it. "You're telling me she was killed?" Harwell held her gaze. "I'm telling you we believe so. And I'm telling you that the same operation responsible for that is currently operating under federal contracts with active military training programs. The breach attempt on your records suggests that Mack now knows you have information connected to his exposure." "Which means he's deciding how much of a problem I am," Dara said. "That's our assessment, yes." She looked at the table for a moment, then at Voss, who had been quiet. His face gave nothing specific, but he was watching her with the attention of someone who understood this was a decision point and was not going to manage it for her. "What do you need from me?" she said. Harwell was straightforward about it. They needed her deployment record formally submitted into the investigative chain. They needed her to walk 2 of their analysts through the specifics of the operational period she'd documented: dates, personnel, supply routes. Because she'd been on the ground and the paper records from that period had gaps that only someone present could fill. And they needed her to be aware that submitting that record made her formally a material witness in a federal investigation, with everything that implied for her safety and her current civilian life. "How long?" Dara asked. "For the investigation? Months," Harwell said. "For the part that involves you specifically, the deposition, the formal record submission, we want to move quickly. Within 2 weeks. And Mack? We have a surveillance operation in progress. The breach attempt he made actually helped us. It left a cleaner trail than anything else we'd been able to develop. We are closer than we have been." Harwell folded her hands. "But I won't promise you a timeline, because I've done this long enough to know that's not a promise I can keep." The man who'd been still the entire time spoke for the first time. His voice was quiet and flat. The voice of someone who had made decisions in bad situations and lived with the results. "The dojo video is still circulating. Your name is attached to it now. That visibility cuts both ways. It makes you harder to move against quietly, and it also marks you." "I know," Dara said. "We can offer protective awareness." he continued. We can't offer protection in the sense most people think of it. You'd be going back to your regular life with an awareness that someone in that life has now assessed you as a variable. I understand the term, she said. He nodded. She looked at Harwell. I'll submit the record. I'll do the deposition. She paused. I want to know what happened to Petra. All of it, as it becomes available. That's reasonable, Harwell said. We'll do what we can. What? She was back in Callaway City by 1:30. She drove to the hospital, not because she was on shift, but because she needed to be somewhere that made sense, somewhere with clear purpose and defined roles. She sat in the parking structure for 8 minutes before going in. Rosa was in the break room on the 3rd floor, eating lunch with the focused efficiency of someone who had 11 minutes left on their break. She looked up when Dara came in, looked at her face, and said nothing about any of it. There's leftover soup, Rosa said. Marcella brought it. It's actually good. Dara sat down across from her and accepted the paper cup Rosa pushed across the table. The soup was tomato-based, thick, with the specific texture of something made from scratch, and then transported in a container that wasn't quite the right size. I'm a material witness in a federal investigation, Dara said. Rosa stopped eating. I can't tell you specifics. Dara looked at the soup. I wanted you to know something was happening, because if anything changes at work, if anyone contacts the hospital asking about me, anyone you don't recognize, I need you to tell me. Rosa set her spoon down. She was quiet for a moment. Is this dangerous? Probably not, Dara said. The people managing it are serious, but probably is the honest word. Rosa looked at her for a long time, not with fear exactly, but with the expression of someone who has known a person long enough to understand that certain things were always going to be true about them, and this was one of those things becoming visible. Marguerite in billing is going to be very confused about how her favorite YouTube story turned into this, Rosa said. Dara almost smiled. Almost. Tell me what to watch for, Rosa said. The call came Thursday morning at 6:03 while Dara was making coffee. Voss, on the number she had saved. We have a problem, he said. Not dramatically, just stating it. Tell me, she said. Mac's operation moved last night. 2 of the facilities we had under surveillance were vacated. Clean, fast, no materials left. The contractor shell company filed a voluntary dissolution notice with the state at 11 p.m. He paused. He's not running, he's restructuring. This is a cleanup before a shift, not an exit. He found out about the investigation, Dara said. We think there's a leak inside the documentation chain. We don't know where. His voice had the particular tightness of someone delivering information they had not wanted to be delivering. We're moving the deposition timeline up. We need you in a secure location today, not Tuesday. Today. She looked at her coffee, which she hadn't poured yet. How long will I be out of my routine? 48 hours minimum. I need to make 2 calls. Make them fast, Voss said. Transport in 90 minutes. She called Rosa first, quick, minimal, no information that wasn't necessary. Rosa said she'd handle the shift coverage and handle anything at the hospital that needed handling, and Dara believed her because Rosa had always been someone whose word meant what it said. The second call was harder. She stood by her apartment window and dialed a number she knew by memory, had known by memory for 4 years without dialing it, and waited through 4 rings. A man's voice answered, older, rougher, the particular voice of someone who spent time outdoors in wind. This is Dara Wynn, she said. A pause. Then, Dara. The voice changed shape, became something that had a long history in it. I was one of the people in the photograph on her wall. He'd been her operational lead for 18 months during her second deployment. He'd known Petra. He was retired, civilian, lived in a state with wide-open landscape he'd told her about exactly once. I'm in a federal investigation, she said. Active. Related to the second deployment. I don't have time to explain it. I'm being moved to a secure location in 90 minutes. A silence. Then, Garrison Mac. It wasn't a question. Yes, she said. I've been waiting for this call for a year, he said quietly. Not to her. To himself, maybe. I have things you need to know, things Petra told me before she... He stopped. Things she told me. Dara's hand tightened on the phone. Can you get to Callaway City? I can be there in 6 hours. I won't be here. I'll get you a contact number, secure. Can you talk to someone from the investigative team? I can talk to whoever needs to hear it. His voice had steadied into something that was beyond anger, the particular resolution of someone who'd been carrying a weight and finally had permission to put it down. Dara, there's documentation, physical documentation. Petra sent it to me 4 days before she died. I haven't opened it because I didn't know who to trust. The floor of Dara's chest dropped somewhere. Where is it? She said. My house. Hard copies in an envelope that's been sitting in my bottom desk drawer for 14 months. He paused. She addressed it to me. Said if she ever went quiet without telling me, I should get it to someone official. I didn't know who official was. I do now, Dara said. Don't open it. Don't move it. I'm going to give you a number and I need you to be reachable for the next 48 hours. I'm not going anywhere, he said. She ended the call and stood at the window for exactly 10 seconds, processing what Petra had done. The foresight of it, the quiet, methodical care of someone who understood she might not make it to the end of what she'd started and had made arrangements anyway. 4 years ago, she'd sent documentation to someone off-channel, someone Mac wouldn't know to look for, and it had been sitting in a desk drawer in a windy state while an investigation circled the edges of what was inside it. Petra had always been the better analyst. Dara picked up her bag, already packed because some habits don't leave, and went to the door. She had 74 minutes. She was halfway down the stairwell when her phone buzzed. Not Voss's number, not a saved contact. Unknown. She almost didn't answer it. Operational training said don't answer unknowns when you're already in a hot sequence. But something made her thumb the screen. Silence on the line. Then a voice she had never heard, male even, completely controlled, said, Ms. Wynn, I think we should talk before this gets further than either of us wants it to go. She stopped on the stairwell landing. The fluorescent light above her hummed. She knew whose voice this was, even without having heard it before. There was only one person who would call this number at this moment with that particular quality of calm. Mr. Mac, she said. A pause. Then, you're more prepared than I expected. You didn't do enough research, she said. I'm doing it now. Another pause. I'm not calling to threaten you. I want you to understand something before the people you're working with make decisions that are going to be irreversible. Then say it, she said. What you have, the record, the list, whatever Vance sent before she died, it's incomplete. It tells a partial story, and the people using you right now are doing so because it serves their timeline, not yours. His voice was steady, reasonable. The voice of someone who had spent time constructing this argument. Before you walk into a federal deposition and become a permanent fixture in someone else's case, you should ask yourself who else benefits from what you're about to say. Dara stood on the landing and breathed. That's a sophisticated way to say nothing. I'm saying the investigation you're walking into has a leak. You know that. I know that because the same people who told you about the leak are the people who have the leak. A beat. Think about that. The line went dead. She stood on the stairwell for 3 seconds. Then she went down the remaining flights and out through the building's side door to the alley where the transport was going to meet her. Her mind was moving at a speed she recognized from the field, the kind that meant she was in a situation where the information she had and the information she needed were not the same set, and the gap between them was where the danger lived. Mac had called to destabilize her. She understood that. Destabilization before a deposition was a rational move if you needed a witness uncertain. The claim about the leak, she couldn't dismiss it entirely because Voss had already confirmed the leak existed. The insinuation that the investigation itself was compromised was a different thing, and she had no way to verify it in the next 68 minutes. She needed to tell Voss about the call. She needed to tell him about the documentation Petra had sent. She needed to do both of those things without letting Mac's words do the work he'd intended them to do. The transport van was at the alley entrance. Same driver, same protocol sequence. She got in. She thought about Petra's envelope sitting in a desk drawer for 14 months, addressed in Petra's handwriting, waiting for someone to know who to trust. The van pulled out of the alley and into the morning traffic of Callaway City, and the building receded behind her, and somewhere in a restructured shell company that was disappearing from official records in real time, a man who had just called her personal number was making his own calculations. She pulled out her phone and called Voss. He picked up on the first ring. Mac just contacted me directly, she said. Personal number. He knows the timeline and he knows about the leak, or he wants me to think he does. And I have a new source, a physical documentation package that Petra Vance sent to a former unit member 14 months ago before she died. Untouched. Hard copy. The silence on Voss's end lasted exactly 2 seconds. Say that last part again, Voss said. Petra Vance sent a physical documentation package to a former unit member before she died. 14 months ago. Hard copies, untouched, still in the original envelope. Dara watched the city scroll past the van window. He didn't open it because he didn't know who to trust. Another silence. Longer this time. Name, Voss said. Reeves. Callum Reeves. He was operational lead during my second deployment. She paused. He's reachable. I told him to expect contact. She heard Voss's chair move, heard him say something to someone in the room with him with his hand partially over the receiver. Not clear enough to make out. Then, the Mac call. What number did he use? Mine. My personal cell. That means he's either had it for a while or he got it recently through a channel we haven't identified. A beat. What did he say specifically about the leak? He said the people who told me about the leak are the people who have the leak. She kept her voice even. He was trying to destabilize me before the deposition. I know that, but I want to be transparent about it because you need to know what he's doing. He's trying to fracture your trust in the investigative team, Voss said. Yes. The question is whether the fracture has anything real to work with. A pause that was half a second too long. We are working to identify the leak. It is not at the level of anyone in this room. That's all I can tell you right now. That's not quite the same as telling me Mac's wrong, Dara said. No, Voss said. It's not. He didn't apologize for that. She respected it. We're moving the Reeves contact to a separate team, people outside the current chain. If the documentation is what you think it is, I don't want it entering an already compromised pathway. Good, she said. We'll have someone reach Reeves within the hour. Stay in the transport. The line closed. She put her phone in her lap and watched the industrial corridor of Callaway City's east side give way to the gray sprawl of the highway, and tried to do what she'd been trained to do in the interval between decisions: nothing. Rest the mechanism. Let the information sit without forcing it into a shape. She managed approximately 4 minutes of that before her mind found Mac's voice again and turned it over. The steadiness of it was what bothered her, not the content. The content was predictable. Destabilization rhetoric was a known quantity. What was harder to dismiss was the timing and the specificity. He'd called her personal number in the window between Voss's 90-minute notification and her transport arrival, which was a window that existed only because she'd made 2 phone calls in her apartment. If he had surveillance on her apartment, audio, not visual, because visual would have been harder to establish, he'd have heard the calls. He'd have known the timeline. She looked at the driver, then at the partition between the cargo area and the cab, then at the interior of the van with the systematic attention of someone running a sweep without tools. She was probably overthinking it. The van had been arranged by Voss's office, the driver had passed the protocol sequence, and the probability of a compromised transport in a 90-minute window was low, but not zero. She filed it and let it sit. Well, the secure facility was different from the one she'd visited Tuesday, smaller, embedded in a different kind of unremarkable building. This one presenting as an insurance adjustment office with a parking lot full of vehicles that were slightly too clean to belong to insurance adjusters. She was walked through to a room that had 2 tables pushed together and 5 people already seated, one of whom she recognized as Harwell and none of the others. The deposition began at 9:47 a.m. and ran without stopping until 12:31. It was not dramatic. It was the opposite of dramatic. Methodical, repetitive in the way of legal procedure, each point established and then restated from a slightly different angle to close off ambiguity. She described the operational period in sequence. She described the supply irregularity. She described the position Garrison Mack had occupied, the sequence of events she'd observed, and the report she'd written that was subsequently downgraded. She described writing the list, why she'd written it, where she'd kept it. The analyst across from her, a woman named Bryce, who spoke only to ask questions and wrote the responses in a shorthand that moved across the page with machine-like efficiency, occasionally pushed back on specifics. Not challenging, just narrowing. What specifically did the manifest show? What was the weight discrepancy? Who was present when the downgrade decision was communicated and in what form? Dara answered everything she could answer and was clear about the boundaries of what she'd observed directly versus inferred. She did not speculate when she didn't have direct knowledge, even when speculation would have been easy, even when the analyst's follow-up questions created obvious openings for it. She had learned a long time ago that the shelf life of speculation in formal proceedings was very short, and the damage it did when it collapsed was disproportionate to whatever momentum it created. By the end of the session, her mouth was dry, and her lower back had lodged a formal complaint about the chair, and she had the particular flatness of someone who has sustained concentration for several hours on content that carries weight. Harwell dismissed the other analysts and stayed. "You did well," Harwell said. "I told you what I know," Dara said. "That's what doing well means in this context." Harwell poured water from a carafe and set it in front of her. "The Reeves contact. Our separate team reached him at 10:15 this morning. He's cooperative. The envelope is intact." She paused. "They won't have visual confirmation of contents until late afternoon, but the preliminary description of what Petra Vance told him about the package suggests it contains financial transaction records that don't appear in any of our current documentation." Dara drank the water. "She was meticulous," Dara said. "She was extraordinary," Harwell said, with a directness that acknowledged the past tense of it without softening it. "She was also working alone, which is why it took this long." "She didn't trust the chain," Dara said. "Correctly," Harwell said. "The individual who downgraded your original report, we've now identified him. He was an Army contracting officer named Dwight Farrell. He retired 14 months ago and is currently employed by a logistics consulting firm that shares 3 board members with Mac's contractor shell." She let that sit for a moment. "We've been building toward his name for 8 months. Your deployment record gave us the specific date of the downgrade decision, which puts him in a documentable chain of decision-making that we couldn't previously establish." Dara thought about the list in her back pocket. Written in a deployment notebook in a forward operating base, late at night, because something about the sequence of events felt wrong, and she'd wanted a record of it that existed outside the formal system she'd already watched fail once. "What happens to Farrell?" she said. "He'll be contacted today," Harwell said. "He doesn't know we have his name tied to the downgrade. People in that position tend to make decisions quickly when they realize the window is closing, sometimes toward cooperation, sometimes the other direction." "And Mac?" Harwell's expression didn't change much, but something in it reorganized. "The facility relocations he executed last night were covered. He moved materials, not people. The people in his operation, training staff, logistics coordinators, most of them have no idea what they're working inside. They're employees." She folded her hands. "Mac himself is currently in Callaway City. We have eyes on him." Dara set down the water glass. "He's here." "Has been since Monday," Harwell said. "We didn't tell you because we didn't want it to change your behavior in a way that telegraphed awareness." "He came here because of the video," Dara said. "Not a question." "We think the video made you visible to him, yes. And then the breach attempt confirmed to him that you were connected to an operational period he needed to assess." Harwell paused. "His presence here is actually useful to us. A man running from an investigation tends to be harder to move against. A man who believes he is managing a situation tends to stay still." "He called me this morning because he thinks he can still manage it," Dara said. "Yes." "Can he?" Harwell looked at her. "Not anymore." She was at the secure facility until 4 in the afternoon, at which point the transport returned her to Callaway City and deposited her at the corner of Meridian and 6th, 2 blocks from her apartment, because Voss's protocols included not dropping witnesses directly at their home address. She walked the 2 blocks in the early evening light of a city that had no idea what was moving through it, past a dry cleaner and a pharmacy and a Pakistani restaurant that she ate at occasionally, and that had nothing to do with anything. She was on her own block when she saw the car. A dark sedan, idling, parked at an angle that was technically legal but practically unusual. Nose first against the curb instead of parallel, which meant it had come in fast and stopped fast. The engine was running. The windows were tinted to the legal limit. She didn't stop walking. She didn't change her pace. She turned at the entrance to her building and went up the stairs and let herself into her apartment and moved to the window at an angle that let her see the street without being visible from below. The sedan was still there. She called Voss. Dark sedan parked below my building, she said when he picked up. Engine running, non-standard parking angle. License? She gave it to him. She'd read it on the way past without appearing to. She heard the keys. Give me 90 seconds. She waited. On the street below, the sedan didn't move. Someone came out of the building 2 doors down. A woman with a stroller, navigating the door with the practiced inefficiency of someone who'd done it 1,000 times, and walked past the sedan without looking at it. The plate is registered to a rental agency in the Eastport district, Voss said. Rented Monday morning. The name on the rental agreement was He stopped. Tell me, she said. Farrell, he said. Dwight Farrell. Dara moved back from the window. You said you were contacting him today. We were. Our team made contact at 2 p.m. He was cooperative, or appeared to be. He confirmed several details and agreed to a formal interview scheduled for tomorrow morning. A pause. He didn't mention being in Callaway City. He told you what you needed to hear to buy himself time, Dara said. That's what it looks like. She thought about the deposition she'd given that morning. Farrell's name tied to the downgrade date, formally in the record now. If Mac had found out, and Farrell had been in contact with Mac, which the board membership overlap suggested was certain, then Farrell would know that his window to be the cooperative witness had just closed. He's not here to harm me, she said, working through it as she spoke. He's here because Mac sent him to assess, to confirm I actually gave the deposition, to confirm what's in the record. Or Mac sent him to make a problem go away, Voss said. Farrell's not that kind of person, Dara said. He's a paperman. He moves things through systems. He doesn't do the other thing. You've never met him? No, but I know his type. She paused. He's scared. Mac told him to go look, and he came because he didn't know what else to do, and now he's sitting in that car deciding whether he's more afraid of Mac or of what he's already done. A long pause on Voss's end. If I send a team to the vehicle right now, we get him. We add him to the formal record, but we lose any chance of using him to get to Mac before Mac decides to move again. If you leave him there, he might make a different decision on his own, Dara said. And you're comfortable sitting above him while he makes it? She looked at the window, at the thin strip of street visible from her angle. I'll let you know if the situation changes. She put the phone on the counter, made herself eat something. Crackers, cheese, the approximation of a meal assembled from what was in her refrigerator, and watched the window. At 5:47, the sedan's engine turned off. At 5:52, the driver's door opened. Dwight Farrell was in his early 60s, heavyset, with the particular gait of someone whose knees had been complaining for years. He was in civilian clothes, dress pants, a jacket too warm for the weather, and he stood on the sidewalk for a moment looking at her building's entrance with the expression of someone having a conversation with himself that wasn't going well. Then he walked toward the entrance. She picked up her phone and called Voss. He's coming up. We have a unit 2 blocks out, Voss said immediately. Not yet, she said. Dara, let him come, she said. Whatever he has to say, I want to hear it directly before it gets processed through anyone else. Give me 10 minutes. She could hear the resistance in Voss's pause, the calculation of acceptable risk against the value of unfiltered information. 10 minutes. Then I'm sending the unit regardless. Understood. She put the phone in her pocket and went to stand near the door. The knock came 2 minutes later. She looked through the peephole. Farrell, alone, his face damp with sweat despite the weather, one hand raised and then lowered and raised again with the tentative energy of someone who had lost confidence in what they'd decided to do, approximately halfway through doing it. She opened the door. He looked at her, up close. His face was worse, not in a threatening way, but in the way of a person who had not slept in several days and whose decision to come to this door had cost him something he was still calculating. Ms. Wynn, he said. Mr. Farrell, she said. He blinked. You know who I am. Since this afternoon, she said. Come in or don't. Either way, close the hallway. He came in. She left the door not fully latched. A small thing, the kind that wouldn't be visible unless you were looking for it. He stood in her apartment and looked at it with the unfocused gaze of someone who wasn't really seeing the space. She watched him. She didn't offer him anything. She waited. He told me you hadn't given the deposition yet, Farrell said. He said there was still time. He was wrong, Dara said. Farrell's jaw tightened. I know that now. He looked at his hands. He told me if I came and confirmed the situation, he could still contain it, that the documentation gap was still large enough to work with. He looked up. That's not true either, is it? We have Petra Vance's documentation package, Dara said. Full financial records, my deployment record, my deposition, and we have the downgrade date linked to your name in the formal record. The color in Farrell's face did something complicated. He sat down in the chair nearest him, her kitchen chair, the one she'd been sitting in that morning, without being invited because his legs appeared to have made the decision independently. He said she didn't have full records, Farrell said. He said what she had was incomplete. She was smarter than both of you, Dara said. Farrell put his face in his hands. It was not performed. It was the collapse of a person who has spent enough time maintaining a position that the moment the position fails, the whole architecture goes at once. He breathed in a way that was ragged and wet and not dignified. She waited. I didn't know what was connected to it, he said from behind his hands. The downgrade. He said it was a procurement irregularity that would create problems for the contracting office if it went formal. I thought it was... He stopped. I knew it wasn't completely clean. I told myself it wasn't my operation. It wasn't my jurisdiction. Petra Vance is dead, Dara said, flatly. Not cruelly, but without cushioning. His hands dropped. He looked at her with the expression of someone who'd known something and not let himself know it fully, and was now being made to. I didn't know that was going to happen. Did you know it did happen? A silence that answered the question without using words. He told you it was handled, Dara said. He said she had become a liability and the situation had been managed, Farrell said. His voice had the quality of something being read off a page he'd hoped never to read. I didn't ask what managed meant. I didn't ask. He looked at the floor. I didn't ask because I didn't want to know. Dara stood across the room from him and let that sit for a moment. She thought about Petra sending an envelope, Petra addressing it to Callum Reeves in her operational handwriting, sealing it, trusting that someone who didn't know who to trust yet would eventually find someone who did. She thought about 14 months of that envelope sitting in a desk drawer while the people who could have used what was inside it didn't know it existed. You have a choice right now, Dara said. The only choice you've had in this situation that was actually yours. Everything else, the downgrade, the years of not asking, those are done. They're in the record. She paused. You can walk out of here and I call the unit that's 2 blocks away and you're taken into custody and the cooperation window is gone. Or you can tell me what you know about Mac's current operation, where he is, what he's doing, who else is in the chain, and I make a phone call to the investigative team with you present. Farrell looked at her. You do that? I'm not offering you a deal. I can't offer you a deal. I'm offering you the difference between being cooperative and not being cooperative, which is a distinction that will matter later when a federal prosecutor is making recommendations. She kept her voice even. That's all I have. He was quiet for 30 seconds. 30 full seconds, which is a very long time to be in a room with someone who has just told you the shape of your situation. He's at the Aldmore Hotel, Farrell said. Room 612. He has 2 people with him, former military, private contract. He's been making calls to a congressional liaison office since Monday, someone in procurement oversight. He paused. He thinks if he can get in front of the right person in that office before the formal investigation goes public, he can reframe the contractor dissolution as a voluntary restructuring and keep the active contracts. He looked at his hands again. He still thinks he has a path. Dara picked up her phone. The next 4 hours moved with the efficiency of a mechanism that had been built over months and was now finally running. Voss's unit came to the apartment. Farrell went with them, not under arrest, not yet, but in the specific custody of someone who understood there was no version of the next several days that didn't involve federal interviewers and the particular experience of telling everything you know in sequential rooms. He looked, when he left, like a person who had been carrying a very specific weight for a very long time and was putting it down in the worst possible way, and the relief and the dread were the same feeling wearing different expressions. Dara sat in her apartment and waited. Voss called at 8:14. Aldmore Hotel, room 612, joint team. We're coordinating with city police and federal marshals. We move in 90 minutes. A pause. You should know. The congressional liaison, Farrell mentioned. We identified him 20 minutes ago. He's a procurement oversight coordinator named Sella. He's been on our secondary list for 6 months. Voss's voice had the particular quality of someone assembling a picture in real time and watching it become something larger than expected. If Mac has been using a liaison inside procurement oversight, the active contracts he holds aren't just fraudulent. They're also currently providing training services to 2 active federal law enforcement programs. Dara sat down. Law enforcement personnel trained under his program. In facilities he controls, using methodologies we haven't been able to review because the contract structure shielded them from standard audit. A pause. We're pulling that thread now. It's going to take time. But you have him, she said. We have the location. We have Farrell's statement. We have your deposition and Vance's documentation. She could hear him exhale. Not dramatically, just the exhale of someone who'd been holding something for a long time and was letting a fraction of it go. We have enough. She stayed on the line while he gave instructions to someone on his end about the liaison contact and the hotel coordination and the separate protective protocols for Callum Reeves, who was apparently now in a secure location with his envelope open and his detailed recollection of everything Petra had told him in her last weeks being recorded by a stenographer in another city entirely. When Voss came back to the line, she said, "When it happens, the arrest, the formal charges, will it be public?" Federal investigation at this level typically results in a public filing, Voss said. Yes. The active contracts, she said, the law enforcement programs he was training, that becomes public too. All of it, Voss said. There's no version of this where it stays contained. The contractor shell, the procurement manipulation, Farrell's role, the liaison. It will come out in sequence and it will be visible. He paused. And Vance's role in building the evidentiary case, that will be visible too. We'll make sure of it. Dara looked at the photograph on her wall. The desert light. 8 people. 3rd from the left. Good, she said quietly. She stayed on the phone until he needed to go, and then she sat in the apartment with the lights on and the window showing the city evening outside. And she thought about the specific quality of a thing that has been a long time in motion finally meeting its consequence. It didn't feel the way she'd expected. It felt smaller and larger at the same time. Smaller because consequences rarely look the way you've imagined them, and larger because the thing that had created the need for consequence was also larger than any single moment could contain. Her phone buzzed. A text from a number she hadn't saved but recognized. The man from the brown jacket, from the dojo. 2 words. It's done. She set the phone on the counter. She was sitting there 12 minutes later when her phone buzzed again. Not Voss. Not Sayers. Not anyone from the investigative team. An unknown number, local area code. She picked it up. Ms. Wynn. A voice she'd never heard. Male. Younger than Mac, younger than Farrell. A particular quality of controlled urgency. My name is Aldrich Sella. I work in federal procurement oversight. A pause. I understand some things have developed tonight that are going to make certain previous decisions I've made very difficult to explain. She didn't say anything. I want to cooperate, Sella said. Fully. I have documentation that goes further than what Farrell knows, further than what Mac shared with him. I've been building a parallel record for 4 months because I understood where this was going, and I didn't know how to get out without... He stopped. I need to speak with whoever is running the investigation. Tonight, before the hotel. Dara looked at the window. Before the hotel, she said slowly. How do you know about the hotel? A silence. A silence that was 2 seconds too long, and in those 2 seconds told her something precise and terrible about what was happening. Mr. Sella, she said carefully. Who gave you this number? The line went quiet. In the background, very faintly, she could hear something that took her trained ear less than half a second to identify. The ambient sound of a hotel corridor. Elevator chime. Distant conversation through walls. A sound that placed him not across the city at a desk with a parallel record, but somewhere in the Aldmore Hotel. At the same time, a joint federal team was 90 minutes away from moving on room 612. Mac had made his last call, and he hadn't used his own voice to do it. She hung up without saying another word. Not because there was nothing to say, but because saying anything further would have told Sella, or whoever was listening through Sella, exactly what she knew and when she'd figured it out. 2 seconds of silence on her end versus the 2 seconds of hotel corridor and ambient that had already said everything. She put the phone on the counter and picked up Voss's number and called it before she'd finished the thought. He answered on the first ring. "Sela just called me," she said. "Unknown number, local area code. He claims he wants to cooperate, claims he has documentation, claims he's been building a parallel record for 4 months. She kept her voice flat. "He's at the Aldmore. I could hear the hotel ambient in the background, elevator chime, corridor acoustics. He's either in the building or close enough to it that the difference doesn't matter." The sound of movement on Voss's end. Voices. A door. "Mac gave him your number," Voss said. "Yes. And the cooperation story is a stall. Mac knows about the 90-minute timeline. Farrell would have told him we were aware of the hotel, or he figured it from Farrell going dark. He sent Sela in front of me to buy time and to get a read on how much we actually have." She paused. "He's trying to see if I'll connect Sela to the team. If I do, he gets a window inside the investigation's response time." "We're moving up the timeline," Voss said. She heard him relaying it to someone in the room. Not a request, a statement. 30 minutes, not 90. Do not engage Sela again." "I won't," she said. "But Voss, sit. If Sela is at that hotel voluntarily, he may actually have documentation. What he said about a parallel record could be real, even if the timing is Mac's orchestration. Don't lose him in the process." A beat. "Noted." The line closed. She stood in the middle of her apartment and did the only rational thing available to her in the next 30 minutes, which was nothing. She was not law enforcement. She was not military. She was a material witness in a federal investigation standing in her apartment 2 miles from a hotel where everything that had been building for 4 years was about to either come apart correctly or come apart wrong, and she had no instrument for influencing which. She sat on her kitchen chair, the one Farrell had sat in an hour ago, and waited. The 30 minutes were the longest she'd spent since deployment. Not because of fear exactly, but because of the specific helplessness of having done everything you could do and arriving at the moment where it was no longer yours to control. She'd given the deposition. She'd submitted the list. She'd opened a door for Farrell and let him walk through it. She'd identified Sela's location in a phone call that lasted less than 90 seconds. She had nothing left to contribute except to sit still and let the mechanism she'd put herself into run its course. She thought about Petra, about what the last weeks of Petra's life must have felt like. Carrying what she knew, not knowing who to trust, making the envelope anyway, addressing it to Callum Reeves in the methodical handwriting she'd had since officer training. Doing the thing that needed doing even without certainty that it would matter. That was the part that stayed with Dara. Not the skill of it, not the courage of it, which was real and substantial, the persistence of it. Petra had kept going in a situation where stopping would have been easier and perhaps safer, and it had cost her everything. And the documentation she'd left behind was sitting in a federal evidence chain right now, doing exactly what she'd built it to do. Some things only matter after the person who built them is gone. That was not a comfort, but it was true. Her phone buzzed at 9:41 p.m. Voss. One sentence. "We have him." The formal charges were filed the following morning. Dara learned the specifics in pieces, from Voss directly, from a secure briefing document Harwell sent to a temporary address, and finally from the news coverage that began around noon when the Federal Public Affairs Office released a statement that was careful and precise and still managed to be more specific than most federal statements in Dara's experience. Garrison Mack was arrested in the Aldmore Hotel at 9:37 p.m. under federal charges that included procurement fraud, fraudulent contract execution, obstruction of a federal investigation, and conspiracy in connection with the death of Petra Vance, whose case had been formally reclassified from accidental to homicide by a joint review panel 2 days prior. A reclassification that had happened, Harwell told her, because Petra's documentation package contained evidence that put a specific individual in a specific location at a specific time that contradicted the original accidental ruling in a way that could not be reconciled. Aldrich Sela was taken into custody at the same location. He had, in fact, been building a parallel record. His cooperation story wasn't entirely fabricated, which was the complicated part, the part that reminded Dara that almost nothing in real situations was purely one thing. He had 4 months of financial records on a secure drive that he'd been holding on to because he'd wanted out of the operation, but had been afraid that cooperation meant his own exposure. Mac had apparently used that fear to position Sella as a buffer, someone who could claim cooperation while actually buying time. Sella had done both things simultaneously, which made him a cooperating witness with serious charges of his own, which was the correct and unsatisfying result for someone who had known what he was involved in and waited too long to do something about it. Dwight Farrell was formally charged with obstruction and dereliction of duty in connection with the downgrade of Dara's original report. His cooperation reduced the charge level but didn't eliminate it, which was also correct, and which Farrell apparently accepted with the specific resignation of someone who had known for a long time that the accounting was coming. The congressional liaison investigation branched into a separate proceeding that was going to take months and touch procurement oversight offices in ways that the initial statement didn't fully articulate, but that the people who understood federal contracting structures recognized immediately from what was implied. The 2 active law enforcement training programs connected to Mac's contractor operation were suspended pending full audit. The personnel who had been trained under those programs were notified of the suspension and the investigation. The audit was expected to take 6 months. The results of that audit were not yet known, which meant there was a real and uncomfortable period ahead where people who'd received training under Mac's methods didn't know exactly what that training had contained or what it meant for their certification status. That was not a clean outcome. There was no clean outcome available for that particular branch of the damage. It would get sorted, imperfectly, slowly, with institutional friction, and the people affected by it would carry the uncertainty longer than they should have to. Dara read all of it, and she sat with all of it, and she did not feel the cinematic satisfaction of a story that had resolved into something simple. She felt the weight of a situation that had been partially corrected after costing a specific person everything, and she understood that partially corrected was the realistic ceiling for most of what the world broke and tried to fix. She also felt, underneath that, something that was not quite peace, but was adjacent to it. The feeling of having not looked away when looking away would have been easier. The hospital found out, in the way hospitals find out everything, through a combination of news coverage and internal communication and Rosa Fielding, who was constitutionally incapable of not telling people things they needed to know. By Thursday morning, 48 hours after the arrest, 3 nurses, 2 residents, the attending physician from Dara's pod, and Marguerite from billing had all expressed some version of reaction that ranged from quiet acknowledgement to the kind of emotional response that Marguerite in particular deployed with the full force of a person who had been following the story since it was a martial arts video, and now understood that she had been watching something much larger. Dr. Fenwick said nothing to her directly. He passed her in the corridor Thursday afternoon and gave her a nod that contained a full paragraph of meaning in a single movement, and that was enough. Rosa waited until their break overlap on Friday. They were in the break room with bad coffee, which was the natural habitat of every important conversation Dara had ever had at Callaway Regional, and Rosa had the reading glasses on the chain and the expression of someone who had processed a significant amount of information and arrived at a specific set of feelings about it. "The woman who died," Rosa said. "Petra. You were close." It wasn't quite a question. "She was my partner for 18 months, Dara said. "Operationally. She was smarter than most people I've worked with in any context." Rosa was quiet for a moment. "Did it help?" "All of it." "Did it help?" Dara thought about that seriously, because Rosa deserved a serious answer. "I don't know yet," she said. "It helped in the ways that matter legally. Whether it helps in the other ways, that takes longer to know." Rosa nodded slowly. "For what it's worth, and I know it's not the same thing, this floor is better because of you. The work you do here is real. It's not a placeholder for something else. It's real." Dara looked at her coffee. "I know," she said. "I know it is." That was in its way the truest thing anyone said to her in that entire period. Not because it resolved anything, but because it named something she'd needed named. That the life she'd built after leaving the military wasn't a lesser version of something, wasn't a retreat or a diminishment. It was a choice, made by someone who understood the costs of violence and had decided to spend her skills on keeping people alive in the immediate and specific way that a trauma floor required. Both things could be true. The person she'd been and the person she was could exist in the same body without one canceling the other. She'd known that intellectually for years, hearing it from someone who knew her only as the nurse she was now, not the operator she'd been. That landed differently. 2 weeks after the arrest, Callum Reeves came to Callaway City. He drove because he was the kind of person who drove long distances rather than flew for reasons that he'd explained to her once and that she'd understood without needing elaboration. He was 58 years old, built like someone who had stayed active without making it a project, with a face that had the particular topography of long outdoor exposure and a way of entering a room quietly that Dara recognized as a habit belonging to a specific professional formation. They met at a diner 2 blocks from her apartment because she hadn't wanted to have this conversation in her home, and the diner was functional and adequately private and had coffee that was better than the hospital's, which set a low bar and cleared it. He sat across from her, and they didn't do the preliminary conversation that most reunions require. They'd been through too much of the same specific thing to need the warm-up. "I should have called," he said. "So should I," she said. "Neither of us did. I kept thinking I'd know when the right time was." "There wasn't a right time," she said. "There was just time." He nodded. He turned his coffee cup in his hands, not nervously, just the movement of someone accustomed to doing something with their hands. "Petra called me a week before she died. She said she was close to something that she needed to get out of her hands and into someone else's. She said she'd sent the package and she told me not to open it unless she went quiet." He paused. "She went quiet 4 days later." Dara kept her eyes on the table. "Did she seem... was she afraid?" she said. Reeves thought about that with the care it deserved. "She seemed like herself," he said finally, which for Petra meant she was processing something serious and not showing it very much. "She said she was tired." He paused. "She said she was glad she'd done it, whatever happened next. That the thing being documented was more important than the documentation being safe." Dara pressed her lips together, nodded once. "She was right," Dara said. "I know," he said. "I just wish she'd gotten to see it." They sat with that for a while. The diner moved around them. A server refilling coffee, a family in the corner, a man reading at the counter. The world continuing its normal operations while 2 people sat in a booth and held the weight of someone who wasn't there. "What happens now?" Reeves asked. "For you." "The hospital," she said. "Oh, the floor, same work." He looked at her. "That's it?" "That's not nothing," she said, which was the more direct version of what Rosa had said, and she believed it more firmly now than she had 2 weeks ago. "I'm good at it. The people I work with are good at it. A trauma floor is not a lesser thing because it's not a classified operation. It's just a different way of doing the same thing." He was quiet for a moment. "She used to say that about you," he said, "that you were the one who was going to figure out how to actually use what you knew, not tactically, humanly. In some contexts that wasn't," he gestured without completing it. "She said you'd find the shape of it." Dara didn't say anything. She wasn't sure she could say anything without it coming out wrong. "I think she was right about that too," Reeves said. Tut. The Kessler Martial Arts Center's review by the Tri-State Board concluded in the 3rd week after the arrest, which meant it concluded in the particular noise of a news cycle that had been dominated by the Mac investigation, and in which a local dojo's professional conduct review was a small and peripheral thing, which was probably appropriate in proportion. The issues at Kessler were real, but they were the issues of a man whose ego had outpaced his character in a context that hurt students and damaged a professional environment. Significant, worth addressing, not in the same moral register as procurement fraud and the death of a federal witness. Victor Hale completed a formal professional conduct review and was required to undertake mandatory training in pedagogical ethics and student safety standards. His championship displays stayed down. The registration numbers for January classes were lower than the previous year, which was the natural market consequence of a public scrutiny event, and he was either going to rebuild on different terms or he wasn't. Theo had sent Dara a message, brief, formal, thanking her for the Saturday session, specifically thanking her for not performing. He didn't explain what he meant by that, and he didn't need to. She understood that he'd been watching 2 kinds of teaching that morning and had taken note of the difference. She didn't respond to the message for several days. When she did, she kept it short. Take care of the students. That's the whole job. She wasn't sure he'd receive it as intended, but she meant it simply, without additional architecture. Well, the formal federal statement regarding the Mac investigation went public in its full form 6 weeks after the arrest, and it was, in the understated language of federal public affairs, comprehensive. Garrison Mack was charged with 7 federal counts. The procurement fraud alone represented misappropriation of funds across 4 contract cycles, covering 3 years of operations. The conspiracy charge in connection with Petra Vance's death was the most serious. It carried mandatory federal sentencing guidelines that made the other counts almost secondary. Sella pleaded to 3 reduced charges in exchange for testimony. Farrell pleaded to 2. The congressional liaison investigation was ongoing and would result in additional charges for individuals whose names weren't yet public but whose connection to the oversight structure had already been internally established. The statement included, in the 3rd paragraph from the end, one sentence about Petra Vance, that her role in preserving and transmitting critical evidentiary material had been central to the investigation's ability to establish the full scope of the fraud and the circumstances of her death, and that her contribution would be formally recognized through the Defense Investigative Services Civilian Honor Designation, awarded posthumously. One sentence. It wasn't enough. Dara read it 4 times and knew it wasn't enough, and also knew that it was what existed within the constraints of federal public communication, and that the work Petra had done was documented now in a chain of evidence that had her name on it and would carry that name through however many years of legal proceedings followed. Harwell called her the afternoon the statement went public. "I wanted you to hear from me directly that Vance's family has been notified in full," Harwell said. "They have been told the complete picture, what she was doing, what she found, what she sent, and what it accomplished." A pause. Her mother asked who she was working with. "I told her there were several people." She asked specifically about the nurse from Callaway City. Dara went still. "She asked to write to you," Harwell said. "I told her I'd pass the request. It's entirely your choice." Dara sat with that for a moment. The weight of it. A mother who had lost her daughter and now knew why, and was looking for the thread that connected her daughter's work to its outcome. "Yes," Dara said. "Tell her yes." The letter came 10 days later. Handwritten. 4 pages in a careful script that looked nothing like Petra's operational handwriting and everything like the source of the methodical precision that Petra had inherited and made her own. Dara read it once at her kitchen counter and then folded it and set it in the frame of the photograph on her wall. The desert light, 8 people, 3rd from the left, so that the edge of it was visible below the frame's lower border. She didn't read it again for a week. She didn't need to. She knew what it said. She knew specifically the last line of it, which she had already committed to memory because it was the kind of sentence that found you once and stayed. She told me she was afraid the work wouldn't outlast her. I want you to know it did. I want you to know she would have understood why it had to be you. 3 months after the arrest, Callaway Regional Hospital's Nursing Staff Development Committee, a body that existed to organize continuing education, share clinical practice updates, and occasionally recognize outstanding contributions, nominated Dara Wynn for the annual Clinical Excellence Recognition. It was not a grand award. It came with a small plaque and a mention in the hospital's internal newsletter and a handshake from the administrator at the quarterly staff meeting. The nomination cited her trauma response record, her CPR certification instruction program, and what it described as consistent demonstration of calm and effective leadership in high-pressure clinical situations. It said nothing about the deployment, nothing about the investigation, nothing about any of it. That was exactly right. She had not wanted that. The nursing floor was its own thing. It had always been its own thing. Mixing the two would have been a kind of conflation she wasn't willing to make, using one to explain or elevate the other in a way that made neither fully itself. She accepted the plaque at the quarterly meeting with the economy of someone who had always been uncomfortable with public recognition and had learned to receive it anyway, because refusing it would have made more of it than accepting gracefully. Rosa sat in the 3rd row of the staff meeting and maintained a perfectly neutral expression throughout, which meant she was working hard to contain something that would have been both embarrassing and affectionate. Afterwards, in the corridor, she said, very dignified. "Thank you," Dara said. "You're welcome." Rosa adjusted her reading glasses on their chain. Marguerite cried. Marguerite cries at the holiday safety video. "She does," Rosa said. "But this time she was crying about you specifically." Dara started walking toward the unit. "I need to check on the post-surgical in 412. "I know you do," Rosa said, and fell into step beside her because that was what Rosa did and had always done. Matched pace without making it a statement. The last thing she did, 6 months after the arrest, and on an ordinary Wednesday evening after a 12-hour shift that had been demanding without being dramatic, was take the photograph off the wall, not to discard it. She set it on the counter and looked at it for a while, longer than she usually let herself. The desert light, the 8 people, third from the left. She counted them, which she had never done in all the years she'd had the photograph, because she'd never needed to count them to know who they were. 8. 4 were still working in some capacity: military, private sector, one who had gone into emergency medicine in a different city. 2 had retired to ordinary lives in ordinary places. 1 had died in the field during a mission she'd never been briefed on because she was already out by then. And 1 had sent an envelope to Callum Reeves and died in a city that was supposed to be safe. 7 minus 1. 1. The arithmetic of it was simple, and the weight of it was not. She put the photograph back on the wall. She added Petra's mother's letter to the frame, visible at the bottom. The corner of the handwritten pages folded outward just enough to see that they were there. Then she made food, an actual meal, not crackers, an approximation, and ate it at the table instead of the counter because it was Wednesday and she had tomorrow off and there was no reason not to use a chair properly. She thought about what Reeves had said, that Petra had believed she'd find the shape of it, the way to use what she knew, humanly, in a context that wasn't the one she'd been built for. She thought she had. She thought the trauma floor was the shape. She thought the quick decisions and the patient families and the 12-hour stretches and Rosa and Fenwick and even Marguerite and Billing, who cried at things, were the shape of what she'd been able to make of herself after the part of her life that had been classified and costly and necessary. She also knew that wasn't a neat conclusion to anything. She still woke up some nights with the particular neural residue of operational memory. She still read a room when she walked into it before she read anything else. She still felt the gap between who she was in any given moment and who she'd been trained to be. Not as damage exactly, but as a presence. Something that lived alongside the rest of her without dissolving into it. That was all right. She had stopped needing it to be otherwise. The things that make people functional in extreme conditions don't fully deinstall when the conditions change. They just wait. And most of the time, waiting is exactly the right thing for them to do. The investigation's final public proceedings were still months away. She would testify. She would answer questions from attorneys whose job was to find inconsistency and who would not find the kind they were looking for. She would do it as many times as the process required, because Petra had built something that deserved to be finished, and finishing it was the only form of obligation that mattered anymore. But tonight was not testimony. Tonight was food at a table in the city outside the window and the knowledge that the floor was covered for the morning and that 412 had come through the surgery with better numbers than expected and had a family member sitting with them right now who had driven 6 hours when the call came and arrived, looking wrecked and grateful and very tired, which was the accurate emotional register for that situation. That family member was one of the thousands of people who moved through Callaway Regional every year without knowing anything about the woman on the trauma floor, except that she was there, and fast, and didn't flinch, and had a way of telling you the hard information directly without making it feel like an assault. That anonymity was not a loss. It was a choice. She had made it years ago and continued making it every day, not because she wanted to disappear, but because she understood something that had taken her a long time to understand, and that she now held with the particularity of something learned through cost. The people who need nothing from you in return are the ones who can give you the most. She had never needed Victor Hale's recognition. She had never needed the dojo's crowd, or the video's comment sections, or the public moment that had accidentally made her visible in ways she'd spent years avoiding. She had needed none of it to know what she was capable of. The knowing had been there long before anyone else saw it. The knowing would have stayed whether anyone had seen it or not. The things you carry in silence aren't diminished by the silence. They're yours, specifically, in a way that public performance can never make anything yours. Mac had called her a variable because he understood that what she knew could unmake what he'd built. But what he'd actually underestimated, what Victor Hale had underestimated in a smaller and less consequential way, was the same thing. Not what she knew, not what she was capable of. What they'd both underestimated was the permanence of it. The fact that the training and the experience and the years of having done difficult things in difficult places for reasons that were real, none of that had left when she'd left the military. None of it had diminished in the trauma unit. It had simply waited, patient, for the moment when waiting was the right response and movement was required. People who mistake quiet for absence tend to be surprised by this. They usually only make the mistake once. Outside her window, Callaway City was doing what cities do. Noise and light and the aggregate motion of thousands of people inside their own specific circumstances, none of whom were thinking about the ones beside them, except incidentally. That was all right. It was probably the correct default. People needed to be allowed to live inside their own stories without the requirement of knowing every adjacent one. She washed her dishes. She checked her phone once. Nothing urgent, nothing requiring response tonight. She put it on the charger and changed and sat on the edge of her bed in the dark for a minute, in the way she sometimes did at the end of long days. Not meditating, not doing anything formalized, just being still and letting the day settle into its proper proportion. Somewhere in another state, Callum Reeves was in the wide-open landscape he'd told her about once. He would be called to testify as well, and he would go, and he would tell everything he knew with the directness of someone who had been waiting 14 months to say it. Somewhere in a federal holding facility, Garrison Mack was in the first months of understanding what it meant to have the structure you'd built. Not just the operation, not just the contracts, but the whole architecture of other people's fear and other people's complicity, taken apart piece by piece in rooms you couldn't control. Somewhere, Petra's mother was in her house with the knowledge that her daughter had not died for nothing, which was not the same as knowing her daughter was alive, but was the only thing that remained possible and was, therefore, something. And somewhere in a desk at Callaway Regional Hospital, in the staff recognition records that no one read unless they needed to, was a small notation that Dara Wynn had received the Clinical Excellence recognition for the year and that she was valued and that her work mattered in the specific and daily and unglamorous ways that kept people alive. That was enough. It was more than enough. She lay down, and the city continued outside her window, and she thought, not for the first time and not for the last, about the texture of a life built after the life you thought you were going to have. How it doesn't look the way you expected. How it asks different things. How the skills that carried you through the worst situations become, in the right context and with the right intention, the same skills that make you present for the ordinary ones. She had been dismissed. She had been reduced to a category. Just a nurse, just a civilian, just someone who got lucky twice on a mat. She had been underestimated by a man who confused confidence with competence, and by another man who had confused power with invulnerability. She had been underestimated by a system that downgraded her report and buried her findings and expected her to accept the burial. None of it had changed what she was. That was the part she wanted people to understand. Not because she needed them to understand it about her specifically, but because the truth of it was not specific to her. It was general. It was the thing worth saying. What you are does not require an audience to be real. What you carry does not require permission to matter. The person who dismisses you has told you something about themselves. They have told you exactly nothing about you. She had known that, in an abstract way, since before she could have articulated it. The years had made it concrete. The dojo had made it visible. The investigation had made it consequential. And the quiet ongoing work of the trauma floor day after day had made it sustainable. She closed her eyes. Tomorrow she would go back to the hospital. She would do the work. She would be present for someone who needed someone present, and she would be fast for someone who needed speed, and she would be honest with a family in a waiting room who needed honesty. And none of them would know her name by next month, and that was exactly as it should be. She had nothing to prove. She never had. That was the whole point. That had always been the whole point. The city breathed outside the window, and Dara Wynn slept.